Hi, fifth grade. Today we're going to work on some math, so please grab your fifth grade math home review packet, and we're going to turn to day 7. This is actually the second page for day 7. We're going to be working with some fractions and some decimals, so let's get started. Day 7. Question 1. Write the fraction and the decimal that is equivalent to the model below. So the model they show us is 3 circles. Each of these circles is broken into a certain amount of pieces. How many pieces are in each circle? You're right, there are 5 pieces. This means each circle is broken into fifths. The next thing you notice is that 2 of the circles are completely shaded in. Those 2 circles represent our whole number. So we will be first writing a mixed number. We're going to write the whole number and the fraction together. So our whole number is 2. For our fraction, we're going to look at this third circle. Again, how many pieces is this circle broken into? You're right, 5 pieces, or fifths, which means our denominator is 5. And out of the fifths, all the fifths here, how many are shaded in? Yep, there are 2 fifths shaded in. So we need to figure out how to turn 2 fifths into a decimal. Now we could divide. We know that every fraction is a division problem. We could write 5 and go through the process of doing this division problem. However, this fraction is pretty simple. We've done a lot of work with kind of understanding what fraction decimal equivalencies there are. So I wrote a couple things down here to kind of help us. Let's say we have 1/5. What is 1/5 equivalent to? Another fraction. Well, we know if we multiply the top and the bottom by 2, we get 2/10. So 1/5 is the exact same amount as 2/10. So if 1/5 equals 2/10, we know that 2 fifths equal 4/10. And so on, if we keep going with the fifths, if we have 3 fifths, it equals 6/10. 4 fifths equal 8/10. And then 5 fifths, or a whole, if it was broken into tenths instead, it would be 10/10. So if we want to write 2 fifths as a decimal, we would write 4/10. But Mrs. Hogan, that's still a fraction. But think about it. Listen to yourself saying 4/10. How would you write 4/10? Well, you know that after a decimal is the tenths place. So how would I write 4/10? You're correct. You'd put a 4 there. 0.4, 4/10. Now, wait a minute, Mrs. Hogan. Don't you dare forget about these 2 whole pizzas we've already eaten. So my decimal equivalency to 2 and 2 fifths is 2 and 4/10. Day 7, number 2. Write the decimal or fraction that is equivalent to each of the following. We've got 5 different numbers here. We either have a fraction or a decimal, and we have to convert it or find the equivalent fraction or decimal to it. So let's start with 4/25. For each fraction, we know that a fraction is a division problem, and that is how we can turn a fraction into a decimal. So I've already written up here, I've written the division problem. We're going to try and fit 25 into 4. Now, can you fit 25 into 4? No, we cannot do that. 25 is way bigger than 4. So what do we need to add to 4 to make it look bigger? Well, let's add a 0. But we have to keep 4 at its true value. So we need to add that decimal and then add a 0. So it kind of looks like 40. Now, if we add a decimal, It needs to be brought up. So now, 25 fits into 40 how many times? Well, I know one 25 is 25. Two 25s, that would be 50. So that goes over. So we know 25 only fits once into 40. So now we do 1 times 25, which is 25. And what do we do next? You're right. We subtract. We see how much is left over once we fit 25 into 40. We end up 0 minus 5. You can't do that. You got to borrow. Take 1 from the 4. That would leave the 4 with the 3. And if we're taking, we are going to turn this into a 10. Ooh. So 10 minus 5 is 5. 3 minus 2 is 1. So we're going to add that next 0 and bring it down. So now we have 150. 150. 25 goes into 150 how many times? Well, I like to count by 25s. It's sort of like counting by quarters, like money. I start with 25, then I go to 50, 75. I've hit $1 or 100. Then 125, and then 150. I look at my hands and I have a total of 6. 6 25s equal 150. So 6 times 25 is 150. So when I subtract here, 150 minus 150, I'm going to end up with 0, which means my division problem is done. And my first answer is 0.16 or 1600ths. Day 7, question 2. We just figured out what the equivalent decimal is for 4 25ths. We wrote it is 0.16 or 1600ths. Let's go on to 2/5. If you remember, in question 1, we figured out that this was 2/5. However, let's try and make that our division problem and solve it that way. We're going to turn 2/5 into a decimal by dividing. So does 5 fit into 2? No, we need to make 2 look bigger. We need to temporarily make 2 bigger so that we can do this division, which means we're going to add the decimal and add a 0. Remember, if we put the decimal down here, we have got to add it up there. So now we have 5 into 20. Well, if we skip count 5s, we've got 5, 10, 15, 20. That was 4 times. 5 fits into 20 4 times. So 4 times 5 is 20. And then our next step is to subtract. We get a 0, 20 minus 20, and so we're done. So for our second answer here, we have 0.4 or 4/10. Our next one here says 9.5. I've got it down here, 9.5. What is another way that we can read that decimal? 9 and what? 9 and 5/10. 5/10. How can we write 5/10 as a fraction? We've got 9 as our whole number, 5/10. Now this is writing 9.5 as a fraction. However, can we simplify 5/10? What do we see that they have in common? If you said the number 5, you are correct. What would happen if we divided 5 by 5 and also divided 10 by 5 to simplify? Remember, we want to make the number smaller, so we're dividing. We would get 1/2. So our answer here is 9 and 1/2. Okay, we've got 7/8. We're going to make that into a division problem. and go through it. 8 does not fit into 7. 8 is larger than 7, so we need to make 7 temporarily look bigger. Remember, we add the decimal and the 0, and we also bring that 0 up. So now we've got 8 into 70. Well, if I skip count 8s, I end up getting to 64 without going over, because 8 times 8 is 64. So I know 8 can fit into 70 8 times without going over, and I know 8 times 8 is 64. What do I do here? You're right. I subtract. I've got 70, take away 64. That will be 6. I need to bring down another 0. Bring down that 0. I end up with 60. So now 8 into 60. Again, I got to skip count my 8s. I've got 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56. If I go again, I go over 60. So I just skip counted up to 7 times. So 7 times 8 is 56. And again, I subtract. 60 minus 56 is 4. And I'm going to bring down yet another 0. My number is 40. Why am I so happy? You're right, because I know 40 is a direct multiple of 8. I know if I skip count by 8, I hit 40 right on the nose. And I do it by going 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, which means now when I subtract 40 minus 40, I get 0. So I know I am done. So my decimal equivalent of 7/8 is 0.875. Day 7, question 2. The only decimal we have left is 6.35, 6 and 35 hundredths. So we want to turn this decimal into a fraction. Well, let's read the decimal. 6 and 35 hundredths. Now wait a minute. We know how to write 35 hundredths as a fraction. Write it now and see if you get what I get. Well, I know my whole number is 6. And then 35 hundredths. Well, hundredths goes in my denominator. And 35 would go in my numerator. So I have now turned this decimal into a fraction. But I'm not done. Why am I not done? You are correct. We have to simplify. We have to simplify because we can see that 35 and 100 have something in common. What's a number that goes into 35 and 100? You're right, 5. So now I can divide 35 by 5 and divide 100 by 5. Because remember, we're simplifying, so we want these numbers to be smaller, so we divide. If I divide 35 by 5, and I count up by 5s, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, I've counted up 7 times. Because 7 times 5 is 35, so 35 divided by 5 is 7. Now, how many times can we fit 5 into 100? Take a second and count up. See what you get. If you said 20, you are correct. So now, for my final problem in number 2, I've figured out that the fraction equivalent is 6 and 7/20. And I know it's the most simplified version because 7 and 20 do not have a number that they have in common.